So welcome back, geologists, and we're here to learn about the types of evolution, and then from there we'll go into the Hall of Mass Extinctions. So the first type of evolution is allopatric speciation. What the heck does that mean, allopatric speciation? So here would be an original population, and let's say that population got separated because of some kind of a barrier island formation from the mainland. And now you've got two separate populations of organisms, and that means the genetics on one side will be sharing their genetic material, and on the other side you have a different set of genetic material. Over time, through genetic drift, you would probably end up with two different types of species that would occur simply because the genetic makeup of a population happens to change in structure and form because of isolation. Let me give you another example how this can happen. Let's say we get a massive mountain building event. Let's say we get a Himalaya in the middle of the North American continent sometime in geologic future. Well, that would separate the east from the west side. This actually happened with the sea back in the Cretaceous Western Interior Seaway that separated the west and the east sides of the continent, allowing for this type of speciation to occur. So you may be wondering how this type of evolution could be different from allopatric speciation. If you've read your textbook, you certainly should have some questions. Adaptive radiation may be the most famous type of evolution simply because Darwin described this in detail about the finches that he observed when he was traveling on the Beagle. So essentially what this means is that you've got a population of organisms that are adapting to a change of environmental stress, usually a change in food resource, a change in environmental conditions for their habitat, and they need to adapt in order to survive long term for their species. So over time, they'll develop some type of a trait, in this case beaks, to adapt to a new food resource on the islands in which they lived. So this was part of the premise of his survival of the fittest concept, was adaptive radiation. Here's how it's different from allopatric speciation. In allopatric speciation, you must have an isolated population. That does not necessarily mean the case in adaptive radiation. So there are times where they can be almost identical, because you can get adaptive radiation in an allopatric speciation situation, but you don't have to have little or no genetic material, allowing for genetic drift to occur. Phyletic gradualism is a bit different. This is the theory of evolution, which states that gradual, long-term, small accumulations of minor changes ultimately derive a new species. And remember, a species must produce viable offspring, so they have to be able to breed and produce viable offspring that are fertile. So if you had a group of organisms like this, let's say shelly gastropods here, over time you would see them make slight changes. And this diagram, this talks about very static conditions, and then all of a sudden we get a rapid change and the animal changes completely. Well, that's more along the lines of punctuated equilibrium. Let's talk about that. This theory states that species do not change much during a majority of their existence, but will have a rapid evolutionary development, usually within a few thousand years, and most likely caused by some type of environmental stressor that occurs. So there's a series of validated punctuated equilibrium types of episodes throughout even modern time where we can see organisms do this type of thing, make a rapid evolutionary changes. Divergent evolution. This is the theory that states of evolution that an ancestral species gives rise to diverse descendants. So you have one common ancestor, and the ancestor produces genetic material that over time, through genetic drift, creates a variety of different organisms suited for different climates, different habitats, different localities. And that would be the premise behind most of all evolutionary development, is that there is common ancestors. So I think we know that divergent evolution occurs because we can trace back our evolutionary history, genetically even, to some type of common ancestor. Now, there are other types of evolution, so let's look at them. Convergent evolution. This is where you have a similar type of characteristic that develops a trait, for a better lack of words, maybe a body plan like you see with the shark, the ichthyosaur, the dolphin. They all have the same basic body plan, but they are distantly related organisms. So they might have developed by divergent evolution, meaning from a common ancestor, but they've developed these very similar traits. And these similar traits represent a need to fit into a specific environment in order to survive. So this would be a good example of convergent evolution. So convergent evolution is very common throughout organisms. In animals and even plants, they share common characteristics while they're not directly related. What is parallel evolution? So this type of evolution occurs when the development of similar characteristics occurs in very closely related organisms which do not exist in the same locality. For example, you've got a falcon, a bat, and a pterodactyl. While some of them live at the same time, meaning bats and falcons, pterodactyls went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous period. But all three of them are very closely related. However, they've developed these same basic traits that allow them to survive in their environments necessity-wise. So mammals in North and South America adapted in very similar ways, even though they did not share the same geographic region. So when you're talking about parallel evolution, another example would be marsupials. When you think about marsupials versus placental animals, they evolved in different places. So they share very common characteristics. That's parallel evolution. So parallel evolution can also be found on areas where we have plates that are separating and animals evolve similarly at the same time. In other words, we would maybe have dinosaurs evolve in Mongolia at the same time that we would have dinosaurs of similar types developing in South America and North America, which is true in the fossil record that we have seen this occur. Mosaic evolution, this type of evolution is when a key specific feature or trait of that organism appears before typical features associated with that group of animals appears in most individuals of that population. A good example would be the oldest classified bird at this time, known as Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx, this is a fossil of them. And by the way, there's just a very small handful of Archaeopteryx fossils around the world. Nevertheless, Archaeopteryx shares avian features such as clavicle, like a fused wishbone, but it has reptilian teeth, a reptilian tail. So there were characteristics of both types of organisms, almost like a transition. So mosaic evolution is that very thing where you get a feature in an animal before they become common. So it's an anomaly, and it could lead to long-term genetic drift to create that to be the norm for those types of organisms. So there's some challenges for applying evolutionary types to fossils. Lingula is a brachiopod that formed for the first time during the Ordovician period. You're going to need to know that time scale, so pull it out and look at it and see where Ordovician is, and it's pretty far down in the Phanerozoic. It comes right after Cambrian. So you're going to need to know that time scale all semester, so you might as well get busy learning it, the order, the duration, the name, so forth. Well, we can say, hey, why hasn't this brachiopod changed much over geologic past? That's fascinating to look at. So how does that fit into parallel evolution, convergent evolution, punctuated equilibrium, allopatric speciation? It really hasn't, has it? It's kind of stayed the same. One thing I'll point out about this guy, since he's here, this is its fleshy stalk that fits into this thing, which burrows into the ground, and this allows the shell to suspension feed, which is a pretty brilliant development, and it's pretty much been that way since it first arrived in the rock record. So very little change for Mr. Brachiopod there. When you consider some mammals, we have numerous examples of mammals that haven't changed very much and others that have changed dramatically over geologic time. You think about camels that originated in North America. Well, camels have evolved over time. We don't find the humps of camels in North American species, but yet we can clearly see them in modern day species of camels. So that could be a need for a development of a trait based on climate conditions over time. Nevertheless, you can't perfectly put every organism into one specific category of evolution. Which brings me into how we classify fossils. Taxonomy is the branch of biology and paleontology that actually describes, identifies, classifies organisms based on groups. Carl Linnaeus was the guy that initially came up with the classification system, and it puts animals into a taxonomy group from big scale to the most specific scale. So from very large, there are a number of different kingdoms. So for example, Kingdom Plantae, Kingdom Animalia. Phylums break up the kingdoms. So if we're looking at Kingdom Animalia, we could break them into multiple phylums like Chordata for the vertebrates, and phylum Brachiopoda for the brachiopods, phylum Arthropoda for the arthropods, phylum Mollusca for things like gastropods, cephalopods, bivalves, pelecypods, and so forth. So nevertheless, phylums are the next biggest category, and phylums are divided into classes. Sometimes there'll be a subclass. A more specific version of a class is an order. Families are even more specific. Genus is the next to the most specific, and then species is individual groups that make up all of these. So they're the most specific and the most described in terms of differential types of characteristics that make up that animal. So they're related in these groups based on a number of different tools that we have available for us in evolution today. Back when the Linnaean classification system was made, we really didn't have genetics. So today we used a couple of other tools such as phylogenetics and cladistics to help us make good references to where we need to classify animals. When we look at taxonomy, many taxonomy displays of where an animal originated from is done on a cladogram. This is an example of a cladogram to the right. It uses a line that branches off in different directions, ending at groups of organisms. So you can see this is a vertebrate here. And then we see we got sharks, we got ray-fin fish, amphibians, primates that branches off to rodents and rabbits. Come up further, crocodiles and birds. Now, we need to point out that these red areas represent changes in the animal. All cladograms have lines that branch off from other lines. These lines can be traced back to where they branch off. These branching off points, such as this one right here, represent, very important, a hypothetical ancestor. Sometimes people refer to this as a missing link. But the hypothetical ancestor is not an actual one. Maybe we have found an actual one, but in most cases it's one that we hypothesize that should exist, that should have combined traits of the lines below and above it. So we don't have a complete rock record or fossil record. Keep that in mind, that there are some assumptions being made in taxonomy. Phylogenetics is a type of taxonomy that refers to the study of evolutionary developments and relationships among groups, which are correlated through DNA and genetics. So we do that also with morphological data, meaning their body shape, their body plan. This type of study is looking at the evolutionary history over time and kind of shows back to where their tracing original ancestor comes back from. So that would be some of your divergent evolution, looking at the different locations. Keep in mind that these nodes represent hypothetical organisms. In some cases, we do have knowledge of where they come from. Geologists were to the point where we need to define an extinction qualify it and quantify it. So I want to talk a little bit about what an extinction is and what it's not, because there's different types of extinctions. Paleontologists and geologists and even biologists around the world define one of these events as where a multitude of organisms in different depositional environments go extinct where they can no longer reproduce. The fossil record shows patterns in which numbers of organisms go extinct. That's how we can actually quantify that one of these events has actually occurred. We find proof in the rock record. We didn't just arbitrarily come up with the Hall of Extinctions and say, hey, there are 5 of them, and guess what? We may have a 6th one occurring. We're looking at patterns from data collected in the field. Another validation for why it's so important to get out and do the work in geology and not just depend on what other people say as validation of data. So let's talk about the hard facts. First and foremost, 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. Does that humble you? It surely does me. If hominids are like other organisms, we'll have our time on Earth and then we will go extinct too. I think it is a bit presumptuous to think that we will exist much longer than other species will have, especially when you look at some of the more complex organisms and how short a brief a period of time they survived. So we're pretty much the most complex organism on the planet at the moment, and we've only been around for about 7 million years. So let's get busy talking about it. It may seem like species evolve in a more complex version, and they do. We have a nice evolutionary tree that shows that there's a progression of development of organisms from simplistic to complex, but these changes do not mean that the animal has a better chance of survival. I think we demonstrated that earlier by talking about natural selection and survival of the fittest. Natural selection produces organisms that are adapted to a very specific set of conditions at a very unique and specific time frame. So to say that a dinosaur would exist and thrive in today's environment, you're taking out the equation of the habitat that they would have needed, the environment and climate they would have needed. I'll give another example. To say that Columbian mammoths could move back to Texas or woolly mammoths move up to tundra in this day and time probably is not that great of a fit. Even if we'd had the human population portion removed, do we have ample grasslands to feed them? So there are a number of considerations to think about as we're talking about extinctions. What we do know is there are really no superhero species in the fossil record. If you wanted to pick one out of all of them, I would have to choose blue-green algae. They've been the simplest life form that we've had, and they've been one of the most durable throughout geologic time. But we think about big, giant, wonderful dinosaurs, and they tend to win the prize as being the most exciting fossils out there. Well, they had a mass extinction event. So let's learn more about what that qualifies as. A mass extinction, known as an MEE for mass extinction event, is defined as a sharp change in the diversity and abundance of macroscopic life. I would also add we have mass extinctions from microscopic life. This occurs when the rate of extinction increases as compared to the rate of speciation. In other words, we're not creating new species as fast as we're losing them. We do have 5 documented, well data proven events that have occurred throughout geologic time. Numerous minor extinctions and even more multitude of background extinctions. So we usually think about a mass extinction affecting global areas, not just a regional area. So when we're looking at the Hall of Fame of Extinctions today, it may seem like I'm leaving out a few very important ones, and I'll give you an example. I'm not going to be talking about the Cambrian extinction event today. We'll get to that when we get to Cambrian. But why am I not? It's not really a mass extinction event. Well, when you compare that we lost 75% of all trilobites that ever lived in that period, it seems pretty significant. And we lost other organisms as well in the ocean. But it wouldn't be till the Ordovician that we'd have our first mass extinction event. You might think that the death of the megafauna in the last ice age should qualify as a mass extinction. Well, how come all the smaller mammals and fauna did not go extinct? That's why it doesn't qualify as a mass extinction event. So again, there are 5 of these, and we're fixing to go through this system and show you characteristics of each. The first one is the Ordovician extinction event. Some people refer to it as the Ordovician-Silurian event, but it's really the end of the Ordovician. This event occurred during the transition between the Ordovician and the Silurian periods, where sea level from the Tippecanoe Sea had regressed temporarily, and we had a mass extinction in the ocean. At this time, we barely had anything on land, so the extinction affected marine environments. 60% of marine invertebrate genera went extinct at the end of the Ordovician, and 25% of marine families. That's pretty significant. Some people rank this as the number 2 extinction event simply based on percentages, but most paleontologists consider the Cretaceous event to be the second worst mass extinction of all time. So this illustration you see right here is from the American Museum of Natural History. As I took a tour there, took a shot of it in one of their display cabinets, and I want you to look at the animals that you see present. These animals were severely hit. I can point out these guys right here are brachiopods. These are the beginning of non-coiling cephalopods. We took a massive hit in ocean biodiversity. And so these kinds of numbers where you end up having some more than 20 to 50% of genera that go extinct, you can consider that a mass extinction event. The second one is in the Devonian period. The late Devonian experienced a mass extinction that wiped out things on land and things in the ocean. We consider the Devonian to be the age of the fishes. This is a placoderm fossil, and to understand how big placoderms are, we'll get to them when we get to the Devonian period. This was like the meanest fish that ever lived. So these are the kinds of things that went extinct. Understand that we had plants on land by now. We had some organisms on land. We're starting to develop amphibians. So we're starting to make some transitions that are pretty significant during the Devonian. So 19% of all families went extinct, 50% of all genera went extinct, and 70% of all species went extinct. So you can see this was a pretty significant deal. The extinction lasted about 20 million years. In all fairness, most extinctions happen fairly quickly in about 1 million years or less. So there was a series of extinctions that went into play in the late Devonian extinction event. No doubt that the Permian extinction event, often referred to as the Permian Triassic Great Dying is its nickname event, killed off more animals, more organisms than any one mass extinction event of all geologic time. If you ask someone today that hasn't had this course, they would probably say the worst extinction event was the dinosaurs. That pales in comparison to how significant life took a beating at the end of the Permian period. 90 to 96% of all species, including marine species, went extinct during this event. That qualifies it as the number 1 worst ever mass extinction event of all geologic time up until this date. In the marine environments, we had 53% of marine families go extinct and 84 marine genera percent go extinct. We're going to see in the marine department, we had 53% of marine families go extinct, 84% of marine genera, and up to 96% of marine species go extinct. So I think you can see this is a remarkably huge mass extinction event. On land, we take a serious hit. By now, we have complex reptiles and amphibians, no mammals, I might add, and no flowering plants. Those are to come during the Mesozoic. 70% of all land species, including insects, bite the dust and go belly up. They go extinct, never able to reproduce again. So the end of the primacy of mammal-like reptiles also occurred. So this was a big change, opening a niche for dinosaurs and archosaurs in the next geologic period of the Triassic. These famous guys right here are not dinosaurs. These are dimetrodons. Dimetrodons went extinct at the end of the Permian as well. So remember that the Permian represents the Great Dying, and it is the absolute worst mass extinction event of all time. Let's move into the Mesozoic era, where we had two mass extinction events, number 4 and number 5. The Triassic extinction event is sometimes referred to as the Triassic-Jurassic marker. In other words, it happened at the end of the Triassic, impacting the beginning of the Jurassic, but we'll call it Triassic extinction event. This mass extinction event wiped out 23% of all families, 48% of all genera, and 70 to 75% of all species. When you think about what happened in the ocean, let's talk about the impacts there. 20% of all families and 55% of all marine genera went extinct during the Triassic mass extinction event. On land, we had significant impacts to non-dinosaurian archosaurs, things like phytosaurs and adiosaurs, which you'll learn about at that point in the semester. Therapsids and large amphibians took a major hit when we had this mass extinction event at the end of the Triassic. In addition, dinosaurs would start to flourish by the end of the Triassic. For instance, this is Coelophysis. Coelophysis is actually related to Velociraptor. It's one of the first types of raptors. This thing is no more than 2.5, 3 feet tall. So this is an actual skeleton that's at the Mesa Lands Dinosaur Museum in Tucumcari, New Mexico. And when you see Coelophysis, it's tiny, but it was top of its food chain at that point. So when you wipe out all the large reptile competing animals for food resources, dinosaurs have a significant niche to fill. They're already in existence, but they're going to really improve during the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. That brings us to the Cretaceous Paleogene, otherwise known as Cretaceous Tertiary, aka KT. Y for K for Cretaceous is the abbreviation for Cretaceous, T for Tertiary. I find it really difficult to think that we're actually going to change our terms to Cretaceous Paleogene, that we would change our definition in all of our literature to KPG for Cretaceous Paleogene, but apparently that's where things are headed with the International Commission on Stratigraphy. Nevertheless, most research and literature written would have KT as their designation marker. This mass extinction event was significant and probably the most famous, and here's why. It impacted land vertebrates substantially. It wiped out 100% of non-avian dinosaurs. I keep using that term. What do I mean? Things that were dinosaurs that weren't birds. Because birds survived this mass extinction event. So avian dinosaurs have been classed under reptilian. And so they now are survivors of this mass extinction event. We had a handful of marine animals that survived that were reptilian, and the most famous, of course, would be sea turtles. The large marine reptiles that were fearsome predators of their time went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. In the ocean, sessile animals at the bottom of the ocean were reduced by 33%. If you look at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, it is a distinct depth layer where you can see that a large quantity of animals on land and in the ocean went extinct. So if we look at it as a comprehensive whole, the mass extinction event wiped out 17% of all families, 50% of all genera, and 75% of all species. So that's why I would put it as the number 2 mass extinction event in comparison to the Permian extinction event. So some of the other famous animals besides dinosaurs that went extinct, things like ammonites right here, never to be heard from again, never to be able to reproduce. So we had significant influences and more to come about the causes of these influences that created this mass extinction event. So there are different types of mass extinctions and different types of extinctions. Background extinctions are natural extinctions that occur at very low rates, but they are nevertheless extinctions that we experience even today. These types of extinctions happen in a random, non-targeted manner. In other words, they can't be attributed to some kind of blunt cause, something that was an environmental stressor that wiped out large concentration of animals. How do we figure out that these particular events are occurring? We use statistics and data from those statistics to analyze and look at trends. So what we'll do is see if we have a large concentration of birds, for example, that are going extinct in the present day. We'll see how many families are going extinct and over what period of time to determine if we're having a background extinction. So is there a sixth extinction event occurring? Let's investigate that. We may be having faster extinction rates right now because the background extinction rate for birds is one species every 400 years. Well, if you look at this natural rate of loss of birds, then we should only have literally 2 extinctions of birds over the last 800 years. However, we have 200 to 2,000 species that have gone extinct during that time frame. So that leads you to believe that there is something happening, and that's one reason scientists feel that we could be headed towards a 6th mass extinction event. So is there an extinction pattern? Maybe. Some studies have suggested extinctions occur periodically every 26 to 30 million years. If that's the case, we should see a mass extinction event through each of those time frames. Considering we only have 5 major mass extinctions, there has to be another set of circumstances that would cause that. So we're going to look at some of those because there are very much accepted profiles that are considered the short-term shocking factors that could lead to a death layer like this one right here. This is the iridium layer from the KT boundary, and there's a massive death layer right here from where avian dinosaurs survived, non-avians did not. Things like ammonites in the oceans went extinct, marine reptiles, all but sea turtles went extinct. And above this layer, this white layer, which is iridium, I might add, comes from mostly asteroids and meteorites. And this layer up here, they're none of those animals. So we need to look at the patterns in detail and make a determination if there are causes that could lead to a mass extinction. The most widely accepted shock events, and what I mean by shock is a pulsation or a short-term environmental shock to the ecosystem. Regressions tend to be like one of the most common. This is when the sea level falls. We see documented worldwide sediments that hold the evidence that the transition from seabed to tidal zone to beach and then ultimately to terrestrial dry land leaves animals without habitat and animals die. Regressions reduce the continental shelf environment, which was a majority of all marine life lives in, and it's by far the most productive living area. So if you reduce continental shelf, you reduce the availability of adequate habitat and competition becomes more fierce. Regressions can also disrupt the cycles of oceanic currents and weather patterns, which can lead to stresses on land. Usually, a mass extinction event associated with a regression is caused by a major ice age like glaciation or reduced mid-oceanic ridge activity, MOR activity. Another type of extinction shock factor actually does create a real shock, and this is when we get hit with an asteroid or comet or meteorite that produces significant dust and particulate emissions that can block out solar radiation, reducing the ability for photosynthesis, thus impacting the food chain. And when the food chain collapses, it collapses both on land and in the ocean. Also, during these events, we'll see sulfur-rich rocks release sulfur dioxide, which can lead to an acid rain problem, thus providing more impact on an immediate basis to the ecosystem. These types of events are also notorious for producing large-scale fires, which can add another land stressor, and I might add climate air quality problem that can lead to additional issues for both land and ocean. Flood basalts may surprise you as one of the most widely accepted theories of shock systems, and we have several very well-documented flood basalt episodes that correspond to the 5 mass extinction events on Earth. At least several of them can be tied to these. Flood basalts occur when there are large regional geographic areas that have mafic, igneous, plutonic eruptions that last for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, that produce climatic shifts. Here's how that happens. Dust and particulate matter get emitted into the atmosphere, causing the same issues we saw with the meteorite collisions. leading to a short-term atmospheric cooling. You're like, well, that's a no-brainer. It blocks out the sun. Well, only a certain color dust will do that. So if you get dark dust, it will do the opposite. It will actually hold and retain that heat. So when you get large concentrations of CO2, carbon dioxide, back into the atmosphere from these volcanoes, that can cause an atmospheric warming. So while you may have a very short-term cooling, you'd likely have a long-term warming trend that would happen with your climate if you had a flood basalt contribution leading to a mass extinction event. Shock events, in addition, can happen because of cooling trends where we have an ice age. This creates more arid environments and causes the Earth's water to form more ice and snow, which makes a more reflective surface for the Earth's albedo, leading to less direct solar sunlight reaching the Earth's surface. So long-term global cooling causes regional specific extinctions, most commonly in the polar regions. So glaciation cycles of the current ice age, believe it or not, we're in a current ice age, appear to have a small impact on biodiversity worldwide, but has a significant impact to places like the Arctic Circle. Global warming events can cause the expansion of warmer climates, forcing specific species to migrate to the poles to survive for habitat or die off. This is one of the main premises of a number of the reasons why animals are making the endangered species list. This will most heavily impact the Arctic and Antarctic regional areas, but we know that during warm times like this, we should expect wetter climates because the snow and ice packs are melting and they provide more volume of water being put into the hydrologic cycle. But as you warm, you also create a mechanism for drying. So the long-term impacts of global warming can lead to desertification and reduced groundwater supplies and surface water supplies, which is a main concern of what's happening in the here and the now across the globe. An interesting one of these theories that has been proven for at least one, if not two, of some very famous extinction events is methane clathrates. What these are water molecules that form a cage like this one around a methane pocket on continental shelves. So you're looking at, let's say out in the Gulf of Mexico, you get a methane clathrate, and methane, since it holds so much heat per molecule, then CO2 becomes a significant greenhouse warming gas. So these cages will break open rapidly, and when they do, large concentrations of methane will shoot up towards the top of the ocean and into the atmosphere. And this leads to a problem because we can actually mark in the rock record, especially in ice cores, when these types of events occur. In the rock record, we can see a fast decrease in the ratio of C13, which is carbon-13 to carbon-12, since methane clathrates are low in carbon-13. So we can actually witness in ancient rock layers that these methane clathrates collapsed and broke apart and released a sudden flux of methane to our atmosphere, leading to a global warming. Another shock event is ocean chemistry changes because there's a disruption between photosynthetic bacteria towards the surface and deep water sulfate reducing bacteria in the deep ocean. When this occurs, there's a mass die-off of bacteria which releases air emissions through the water and up into the atmosphere of hydrogen sulfide. Well, this will cause the ozone layer to be depleted, and this is how it affects organisms on land. Once the ozone layer becomes weakened, life on land is exposed to harmful ultraviolet radiation. Life in the ocean is going to be poisoned by anoxic conditions, and so it's a double whammy. You get land and water impacted at the same time. It's thought to be that another shock event can be something called a supernova. If you're not familiar with supernovas, these are actually where a star explodes. Not all stars explode. There's very specific qualifications for the types of stars that and size that they must have in order to have a supernova. Like our star probably won't produce a supernova, it will become a white dwarf. Nevertheless, supernovas are what regenerate matter in space and allow for new solar systems and suns to form. If one of these events, or a gamma ray event, were to occur within 6,000 light years of Earth, this could destroy our ozone layer. So this is something that would be out of our control, obviously, but if this were to occur or has occurred in geologic past, you could imagine the impact that this would cause from solar winds, from radiation, so forth, that would reach planet Earth. That could be a major shock event to an ecosystem that existed at that time. 1 or 2 gamma ray bursts occur every million years in a galaxy on average. So these are not common events, not something we really need to worry about for us at this time, but if it's happened in geologic past or were to happen in geologic future, this would be something significant, which is a correlation to why astronomy is important, because if one of these supernovas would have occurred, let's say 6,000 light years in the past, that light could just now be reaching us. That could wreak havoc on our ecosystem today. Geomagnetic reversals have the potential to weaken the Earth's magnetic field, which would allow solar winds to come in and actually kind of wipe out our atmosphere, certainly cause a disruption to the oxygen ions, which would immediately impact our ozone layer, making our atmosphere go away. So this disastrous drop in atmospheric oxygen and the ability to hold an atmosphere could lead to a shock event that would cause a mass extinction. Plate tectonics are also thought to be a long-term impact to extinctions. As plates move, they open and close niches. It may be surprising, but when continents are all clustered together, biodiversity is at its lowest. When they're separated, it's at its highest, because evolution finds a way to fill the niches that are available. So plate tectonics contribute to mass extinctions because in their specific positions, they can cause several things to occur. They can open or close seaways or land bridges, so that can cause isolation or ability to migrate for organisms. It can initiate or conclude an ice age. So, for example, the Arctic Circle in the Cenozoic, the continents in the Arctic Circle moved further north and kind of positioned themselves in a way that closed off oceanic currents to the Arctic Ocean basin, which led to the development of our first major ice pack, continental ice pack that is, allowing for glaciers to start forming, which contributed to the beginning of our ice age that we know as the Pleistocene. We know that plate tectonics, as plates gather all together, we don't have adequate circulation of oceanic currents, which can definitely lead to a change in climate. And that can lead to a fall in the ability of climate to work properly on Earth, which will impact oceanic and land species together. So when you have a supercontinent like Pangaea, for example, this also reduces the total amount of continental shelf available for organisms that live in the ocean. And since the majority of all organisms live on that continental shelf in shallow water, they require very specific conditions to exist to live. So if you correlate like the worst mass extinction of all time, which is the Permian, we had very minimal continental shelf, and that was impacting significantly to about 96% of marine life to go extinct. Remember, scientists do not agree on the exact causes of each of the mass extinctions that we learned about for the Hall of Mass Extinctions. A general consensus is this: you have a long-term stress or stressors, and then some kind of impact, like a shocking event that we just learned about. For example, this is Meteor Crater in Arizona. This would be an example of a shock event. So you get hit by an asteroid or a meteorite, and you already had declining environmental conditions. This could finish the job. So usually it's a accumulation of factors that lead to these mass extinction events that cause the die out of enough organisms to qualify as a mass extinction. So you have to go back to that definition of a mass extinction that affects multiple species in multiple habitats. So more to come with our extinctions as we go through this semester. But I seriously want you to think about extinction and what that means to you and to me. So are we in a sixth extinction? What qualifies us to be in one if we are? Can we stop it? What do we need to do as humans in order to recognize that and to realize that we are vulnerable to the same circumstances that killed the dinosaurs, that killed almost all life on Earth at the end of the Permian, the Ordovician mass extinction event that was so significant to the first really big flux of development of life? So we've seen these 5 extinction events that we can name. You need to know them, when they occurred, and we'll be adding more detail through this semester on what caused them. I'll see you at the next lecture. Bye.